Chapter 82, Asau's POV. Asau knew he shouldn't have snapped at Hanyu. If all his dark speculations of the last few months were true, if Hanyu really were some sort of genius of manipulation, putting on a cheerful facade to win Lord Antony's favor, if that were so, then it had worked. His former lord's guests had been abuzz for the last week about the way Lord Antony doted on his new pet. That would make it not just foolish, but dangerous for him to vent his despair on Hanyu. The last thing he should do was anger the man who held his future in Lord Antony's rooms in his hand. On the other hand, if none of it were true, then he really was the same old Hanyu, not all that bright, but sweet and impulsive. If that was the case, then all his fussing attentiveness was genuine, and Asau was hurting one of the only people who still cared what happened to him. That would be no wiser. Asau had lain awake for much of the night as Hanyu snored and thrashed next to him, swearing not to do it again. He would be better tomorrow. He would integrate himself with Hanyu and start learning how to please his new master. Shit, that was a daunting thought. He had felt like he was finally learning how to please Lord Marcus, and now he had to start all over. Was he even strong enough to survive another learning curve like that? Perhaps it wouldn't be so bad. Lord Antony had always been so unfathomably kind to him. Asau had wished so many shameful, tear-stained wishes that he could be his. Now that he really was, though, Lord Marcus had been rough. He'd known that. He'd seen the way everyone had looked at him, horror and pity, and he'd wanted to laugh. Yes, look at me, he'd thought every time. My lord is rough, as a war god should be. He stakes his claim on me with hard words and harder hands. He beats the dross for me like a skilled smith. Back in the temple, we thought we knew what it was to submit, but now I see how shallow and flawed your obedience is. Could you withstand the refining? It seemed so hubristic as he tasted the rhythms of this new life. As Hanyu stirred and woke beside him, as Lord Antony called a strangely hesitant good morning to them both, as a knock sounded at the door, as he picked at his breakfast in Lord Antony's bed, Hanyu chattering endlessly beside him. He had thought that Lord Marcus was perfecting Asau for himself, making him the ideal slave for his use, but these things were piled outside Marcus's door. He'd thrown Asau out without a second thought. Of course, it was his right, if that was what he'd wanted. Asau was his to do with as he chose. If what he chose was to dispose of him, well, Asau had no just cause to complain. But if all that punishment wasn't intended to make Asau perfect for him, then it was simply punishment. No grand trial, no brutal but necessary refining process, just a consequence of Asau being stupid and displeasing. And if he no longer belonged to Lord Marcus, then it wasn't even a helpful series of punishments. All his hard-earned knowledge of the god's preference was useless. Without his master to serve as he'd learned to do, then it was all just pain, just excruciating, torturous suffering that meant nothing. He hadn't just lost his lord, he'd also lost any sense that all his anguish had been for something. Hanyu kept saying that Lord Marcus didn't discard him, that Lord Antony had forced the war god to give Asau up. But neither of them had been there to see what had really happened, and frankly, Asau had seen more of the two gods' interactions than Hanyu had. He couldn't imagine that Lord Antony would have carried out his threat to claim him if Lord Marcus had proved resistant. He always tried to appease Lord Marcus, even if he had to do it by submitting to the sorts of punishments that Asau could never have imagined being meted out to a god, let alone their lord. Surely Lord Antony wouldn't have changed that pattern just to acquire him. But however it had happened, one thing remained true. He belonged to Lord Antony now. Consequently, he needed to figure out what his new master wanted to do with him, and make it as easy and pleasant as possible for him to do it, no matter what it proved to be. It wasn't much of a plan, but it was all he had. Carrying out that plan wouldn't be easy with both himself and his new master ordered off their feet, so it was a relief when Lord Julia reappeared right after breakfast and declared that Lord Antony could walk about the cabin. I still don't want you leaving these rooms, she said, her stern voice easy to hear from the bedroom. Especially not to go either up or down a level. You shouldn't even dream about stairs for another 3 days. It made Esau wince to hear the way she ordered Lord Antony around, but he took it meekly enough. Don't worry, he told her. I'm sure I'll be able to restrain myself. None of you are that exciting to talk with, anyway. Lord Julia snorted. That's a pity, because half the ship has expressed their intention to come visit you. Felix will be bringing someone for you to feed from. Thaddeus and Cloelia want to talk your ears off, and I think Theo mentioned that she plans to stop by as well. Is she going to bring Kenta? My lord. On you. Esau tensed, automatically running a list of the rules the other man had broken. Speaking without permission, asking impertinent questions with no bearing on his service, failing to use any honorifics, and transparently tacking on one too late to be polite. A lifetime's instinct screamed at Esau to run into the room and start apologizing for his friend, pull him down into a bow, try to invent some way to make the discourtesy his fault instead of Hanyu's. He had to grip a pillow with his good hand, anchoring himself enough to fight down the urge. It was a stupid impulse, one that had long outlived its usefulness. Hanyu was no longer the clumsy friend who might be sold at any moment if Esau wasn't vigilant, nor was Esau the cosseted darling of a temple that would forgive him anything. Now, Hanyu was the treasured prize slave of a lord of the gods, and Esau was a bedridden newcomer with no way to prove his worth. He was no longer convinced that he even had any worth to prove. As if to confirm his suspicion that Hanyu would be indulged no matter how he behaved, neither god said a word about his uncouth interjection. Instead, Lord Julia answered him without the slightest change in her tone, as if there was no difference between addressing Hanyu and addressing Lord Antony. I don't know. If I see her, I'll ask, but I'm sure she'll fetch anyone you like. It's hardly a perilous voyage from one cabin to another. Then she came in to examine Esau and change his bandages, and that was the worst of all. He knew he looked ridiculous when he tried to bow on the bed, but what was the alternative? Raise your head, she ordered. That was a relief, but Esau couldn't relax because Hanyu was trailing at her heels, wide-eyed and clearly not making the slightest gesture towards deference. As Lord Julia examined Esau's broken finger and changed the little squares of bandage she'd stuck on his scalp, his shoulders, the back of his neck, his upper arms, Hanyu kept hovering with those infuriatingly big, concerned eyes. I will not glare at Hanyu or pick fights with him. Then Lord Julia was flicking the blanket aside and reaching for his bandaged thigh, and the feeling of her chilly fingers touching him there made him flinch away and tense up like a flighty bird. It was so pointless. He was being ridiculous, and not just ridiculous, but ungrateful and disrespectful, and a host of other things he wasn't allowed to be. But it felt as if his body, his skin, was acting on its own, trying to flee her careful hands, and he had no way to stop the reactions. Lord Julia pretended she didn't notice, but he knew she did. She slowed her movements and avoided touching his skin as much as possible while she unwound the bandage. His face burned with mortification. Oh, gods! Hanyu's voice, shocked and close enough that Esau probably could have hit him with a pillow, which suddenly felt like a very appealing prospect. What happened? What had happened to that thigh was that Lord Marcus had honored Esau with his attentions for the 3rd time in one night, and instead of receiving this privilege gratefully, Esau had given into his weakness and released both displeasing noises and repulsive tears. His master had cut him a reminder to behave better in the future. He'd been merciful, punishing Esau so he could learn how to please his god better in the future. An ungrateful slave could expect no better. So why did Esau suddenly feel like screaming at Hanyu and, suicidally, Lord Julia that it was none of their business? Lord Julia whirled, and though Esau couldn't see the look she was giving Hanyu, he saw his friend's eyes widen. The god's voice came out cool and even, whatever face she was making. We don't need any help right now. Why don't you go check on Antony? He's probably already trying to decide the heaviest possible piece of furniture he could carry up a ladder as soon as I leave. Yes, my lord. Hanyu bobbed a bow before fleeing. It was appallingly unpolished, but it was also the most proper behavior Esau had seen from him all day. Once he was gone, Lord Julius stood and stalked over to shut the door a little harder than was probably necessary. When she stood over Esau again, she sighed. "I'm sorry, Esau," she said softly. "I forgot he had followed me in. We'll finish this in privacy." Esau's voice wavered a little to his horror. "My lord owes me no apologies. I am only sorry that my lord's healing talents are being wasted on the likes of me." "Don't be ridiculous," she snapped, brisk again, and though he flinched a little at her tone, he was relieved that the strange softness had vanished. "Healing is never wasted. Anyhow, if I didn't patch you up, I'd never hear the end of it from a long list of people." She didn't speak again as she finished applying her medicines and winding her clean bandages. That was a relief. It was also a relief when she pretended not to notice the traitorous tears that slipped down his face and into his ears when she applied that strangely warm ointment inside. "There," she said when that was done, wiping her hands and setting to gathering all her bottles and implements. "Now you'll be ready to receive your army of well-wishers." He thought she was exaggerating, but almost as soon as she'd bade farewell to Lord Antony, and Hanyu, which was strange, but hardly the strangest thing about the quiet healer, there was another knock at the door. For one wild moment, Esau thought, "My lord is coming to take me back," and his heart leapt and he cowered into the blankets at the same moment. Instead, he heard Lord Theodora's voice, deep and growly as it had been when she told him to come with her to these very rooms, or to her own for a meal. It was familiar, but he would always remember best the way she had screeched, high and rough and strike deadly, when she told his master, his old master, why could he never think it properly, to get his hands off Lord Antony. He couldn't help cowering at the sound of her voice and heavy steps. Just the thought of her lowering face seemed to put him back in the moment when she and Lord Marcus had fought, their speed and power unleashed on each other in its nauseating totality. Whatever beatings and punishments he had received since boarding the divine ship, Esau had never felt so keenly his own mortal fragility as he had in that moment. He had known that a single misplaced hand or foot would crush him like the tiniest ant. Esau had to bury the remembered terror and try for a smile when Hanyu barreled through the door, an anxious-faced Kenta in his wake. "Hey, Esau," he chirped. "Look who's here!" Esau didn't really want to see anybody, but Kenta was a less terrible option than most. His smile grew a little without his having to force it at all. "Hello, Kenta. How are you?" "Esau!" Kenta rushed over, his round face splitting almost in two with his own smile. "Hiroki and everyone was so excited to hear the news. Congratulations!" It took Esau a moment to realize that Kenta meant the news that Lord Antony had claimed him. He supposed that congratulations were indeed in order, little as he might feel like celebrating. He also supposed that Hiroki and everyone meant the rest of Lord Theodora's men. They had all clustered around him when the god dragged him off to her chambers, half delirious with terror and confusion, not unlike his current state. Once their master explained that he belonged to Lord Marcus, their faces had closed, and they had stopped meeting his eyes, though they had been almost excessively kind and attentive for the entirety of his brief stay. "Would you please thank them for me?" he said now. "Kenta's going to feed Lord Antony," Hanyu blurbled. When Esau winced at his near slip, he flinched as well. "But Lord Theodora says he can only do it once, so Lord Felix will bring someone else tomorrow." Giri offered too, but it was probably intended as an assassination attempt, Lord Theodora put in. Her interjection reminded Esau that the door was wide open and the gods could hear this conversation. Immediately, his pulse spiked and his throat closed. "We're being too loud. We're making a fucking nuisance of ourselves. He doesn't like it when I flap my fucking jaw. He'll put my mouth to better use. I'm in trouble, 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 trouble." He was jolted from his sudden panic by yet another knock at the door, this one much quieter and more tentative than Lord Theodora's. Hanyu sprinted out of the bedchamber and hollered, "Don't get up!" presumably at their master. Esau couldn't restrain the whimper that ecked its way out of his mouth. Kenta looked at him, soft and concerned as all the others, and for just an instant Esau hated him with a blinding flurry that sliced hot and clean through all his fears, obscuring the god's greetings to the newcomer and everything else in the world besides himself and the object of his loathing. "Don't you look at me like that, you little fucker. You can take all your cow-eyed pity and choke on it. I'm still the temple's best and—" As quickly as it came, the ugly rage evaporated. It left Esau trembling and grateful that he hadn't actually opened his mouth and spat out any of those poison words at Kenta the way he kept doing with Hanyu. If I keep this up, I won't have any friends left. Hello? Oh dear, excuse me, I didn't mean to interrupt. I'm so very sorry. The meek little voice was accompanied by an equally meek little figure. A small man with a full, generous belly and nervously wringing hands had come to stand in the doorway. He was bobbing a little, not quite bowing and not quite ducking his head, but seemingly caught between the two. His face was soft in ways that went beyond its roundness, though Esau couldn't have said exactly why. His large, dark eyes flicked anxiously from Esau to Kenta and back again, and when he flashed a desperately integrating grin, his teeth were white and sharp. Esau dropped his gaze at once and murmured, "My lord," in chorus with Kenta as they both moved to bow. "Oh, no, oh dear, please don't," the meek little voice implored. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but now I'm just repeating myself. Esau, I only wanted to bring you a get-well gift, and here it is, so I'll go now. Goodbye!" Light steps hurried away, and Lord Antony asked, "Leaving already?" A moment later, the door shut, and Esau dared to raise his eyes. A little bouquet of moon lilies lay on the floor, set down like an offering at an altar. Moon lilies? Impossible! They had been at sea for months now. Moon lilies weren't even in season anymore. Kenta, who was smiling broadly and didn't seem nearly as dazed as Esau, picked them up and brought them over to the bed. Once he'd held them, Esau could see that the flowers were made of painstakingly folded paper. Some of the paper had even been dyed green to make the stems. He held the fragile little constructions as loosely as he could, suddenly afraid that he would crush them. "Sorry about that," Hanyu's voice, making Esau's hackles rise and his burgeoning wonder at the gift recede. "Thad was acting awfully weird, wasn't he?" "Not all that weird," Lord Antony said from the sitting room. "He gets nervous about new people. He'll settle down eventually." That was Lord Thaddeus? Esau had been bent in his bow for the whole altercation on the deck, but from the strength with which the god had shoved him away, and the rage with which he had berated Lord Marcus, Esau had pictured someone much more extraordinary. It was blasphemy to think so disrespectfully of any of the gods, he knew that, but surely if Father Shu had ever seen a god bobbing and stammering like that, he would understand. The conversation moved on, Lord Antony and Lord Theodora and Hanyu and Kenta all chatting as if it made any sense for the four of them to converse together like equals. Esau was too tired to follow any of it, or even to muster any real fear at the liberties his friends were taking. He'd learned that there were limits on fear. Sooner or later you just drifted, numb, until your mind had a chance to rest up and descend back into gibbering terror, which he was sure his would do soon enough. For the moment, he just stared down at the carefully folded moon lilies. He remembered the real ones the crowd had thrown as the offerings paraded from the temple to the choosing dais, white blossoms raining around them like stars descending from the heavens in their honor. He remembered how Hanyu had glowed and beamed, loving the attention, and how he had caught a blossom and tucked it behind Esau's ear. He remembered that the first time his old lord, had touched him, it had been to take that moon lily carefully from Esau's hair and then crush it so that its perfume filled the cabin. Esau stared down at the paper flowers and, in his most secret heart, made the same shameful, blasphemous wish that he had made that night and 100 times since. He wished that he had never entered that parade, never stepped onto this ship. He wished he could have stayed home in the temple forever.